I want everyone to imagine that we are about to rob a bank. Not that I have any experience in this area, but what would you put on your list if we were to rob the bank successfully? I know on my list, I'd probably put a threatening letter to give to the bank teller, maybe a getaway vehicle, perhaps a weapon, a really good disguise too, that would be great, some lemon juice. Wait, did lemons just appear on my screen? They totally did. In 1995, a man by the name MacArthur Wheeler robbed 2 banks in the Pittsburgh area without any disguise whatsoever. Instead, he believed that he could run lemon juice all over his face, and it would render him completely invisible to everyone's sight. As a matter of fact, when police later used the video surveillance to arrest him hours later, he was genuinely shook. He said to them confusingly, "But I wore the juice." I bet you're probably wondering right now, how could someone be so foolish? But I'll encourage you to look a little bit closer to home. For example, how many of you have known about the deadline to an assignment for the entire semester for a particular course, but you only started to work on it 1 to 2 days in advance to realize that you're in over your head? Or how many of you have felt super confident going into a test, like the most confident you've ever felt, only to realize that you performed the worst out of your friends when you got your grades back 2 weeks later? And finally, how many of you have eagerly put up your hand in class, confident that the content was really clicking for you, only to realize that you were completely misunderstanding everything and your professor had to brutally correct you? These are all great examples of how ignorance, we are very bad at being able to indicate our own ignorance in our everyday life. So cognitive psychologists have an actual name for this. They call it the Dunning-Kruger Effect. This is a cognitive bias that occurs when our lack of experience and awareness in a particular domain causes us to overestimate our own abilities. This, in effect, explains why individuals like MacArthur Wheeler tended to think of himself as an expert without anything to improve with robbing banks when clearly he was at average or probably below average, to be frankly honest with you. But what explains this effect? Well, to begin, there's a substantial body of research that suggests that we overestimate ourselves to mathematically impossible degrees. For example, 2 out of every 3 Americans tend to think that their IQ is above average when there's no way that 67% of Americans are above average with their IQ. Second to this, regardless of other people's ratings of them, unattractive people tend to think that they're disproportionately more attractive than the average population. And finally, 3 out of 4 Americans tend to think that they can correctly discern true from false news headlines, when in reality, they can't. So findings like these kind of influence Dunning and Kruger to look a little bit deeper beneath the hood of our overconfident biases. In particular, they administered a series of tests to a group of Cornell students that required a high level of knowledge and awareness for a particular domain. One specific domain was humor, and they asked the participants to assess their performance on a humor test, which required them to distinguish good jokes from bad jokes. And on the graph here, we can see their scores plotted into 4 different quartiles based on 0 to 100 percentile sort of scale. And they also asked the participants after completing the test how they thought they did, and these are the results. Paradoxically, those in the bottom quartile actually had the greatest disparity between their actual scores and their perceived scores, while those in the highest quartile actually had the lowest disparity. These exact same paradoxical effects were subsequently repeated for a grammar test and a logical reasoning test. So this begs the question, why are the bottom quartile performers so bad at guessing how they would do? Well, Dunning-Kruger reasoned that when people are incompetent in a specific domain, they actually suffer from a double burden. This being that their incompetence doesn't only lead them to make erroneous conclusions and silly mistakes, but their incompetence also robs them of the awareness to be able to recognize those being as mistakes in the first place. So this sort of shaky double burden occurs in a lot of domains in life, where the ability to evaluate something as being good or bad actually relies on the exact same skill set of making a correct decision in the first place. But I'm sure I've probably lost everyone's attention by now, and you're thinking, at least I'm not incompetent, right? Well, I'll just remind you of all these examples that we talked about earlier, and all the blushing in the crowd would lead me to believe that that is definitely not true. So the fact of the matter is that the Dunning-Kruger effect, we're all susceptible to it. And this is because we all have blind spots that we might not be aware of. So if sulky gaslighting isn't the solution to this problem, what can we do about it? Well, let's return to our double burden of incompetence here, and just think about it. If we were to logically try to think about a way that we could kind of reduce the load here, there's only really one direction we can go. It wouldn't make sense for us to reduce the number of mistakes that we make first without being unaware. So we have to reduce the extent of our unawareness in order to make our mistakes more salient, so then we can also reduce them. What are some ways that we can maybe go about doing this? Well, for starters, you could Seek feedback from others, especially in domains that you are less experienced in or suck at, for lack of better words. You could also find ways of testing yourself, also in domains that you completely suck at. And finally, you can just maintain a skeptical attitude and just be rational and think of ways that other people are better than you. So this kind of brings me to the end of my talk, but if there's any takeaway that I want to have for you guys, rather than shrieking away from incompetence as something to be embarrassed about, I would encourage you guys to look it right in the face, because it might just be the next opportunity for you to grow, learn, and transform yourselves to be better people. Thank you.